That song I tried to play, that was a song by Duke Ellington called "The A Train," and it's a good song. And we'll get into this music a little later, but right now we need to start from the very beginning. Edward Kennedy Ellington was born on April 29th, 1889. He was born in Washington, D.C., and he was raised in a middle class family. And for a black family at the time, that was a privilege. And the ironic thing about it was both his parents were piano players. So at a young age, he studied and played the piano, and he basically became a musician. Ellington being a soda jerk at the time, which was a person who serves and sells soda, he had soon written his first composition titled The Soda Fountain Rag. Ellington always dressed well. He always practiced good mannerisms, and he was very sophisticated, and people started to call him the Duke just because of that, and it stuck. He kept the name the Duke. Ellington was awarded an art scholarship to the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, and Ellington followed his passion for ragtime and played professionally at the young age of 17. Ironically, Duke Ellington was around to see the racial riots of 1919's Red Summer, which was 3 months of bloody violence directed at black communities in Chicago, San Francisco, and it even happened in Washington, D.C. at the time. However, when racial injustice continued to grow, so did his music. In the early 1920s, ragtime evolved into another form of music called jazz. Ellington had a band that was originally called the Duke Serenaders that played during the end of World War I, and by the time they arrived in New York around the early 1920s, they changed their name to the Washingtonians. And at that time, jazz had become an integral part of the Harlem Renaissance. Jazz was more done with improv and more expressive and more complex than ragtime ever was. Ellington had to write music that could be in tune with each of his players' style. They began playing in the prominent spots of Harlem, and with a lot of changes that were made in music, Ellington had quickly adjusted, whether it was through his musicians creating their own signature styles, or whether it was to adjust to play in front of a predominantly white audience. Most of these clubs had one thing in common besides the problematic racist name. It was that it had segregation throughout the clubs. Most of these clubs had black performers and all white audiences. The club had most of its known still being black. The Cotton Club was most known for this, but still was the biggest club in Harlem. And the Cotton Club took in most notable artists known at the time. By 1927, Duke was fortunate enough to be a performer at the Cotton Club. His music that was described as jungle music, which was thought to be a good fit to match the description of the decor of the club because of his primitive look. Ellington took advantage of the opportunity and presented the best of his music. By 1943, Ellington played Carnegie Hall and actually gained respect even with classical composers, and at the time for a black composer, it was almost unheard of. Ellington began to work on a project called Jump for Joy, which was combined with comedy skits and music into a revue that included Dorothy Dandridge and Langston Hughes. This project was important for expressing African American culture, and Ellington would soon get to a point where his name was basically the definition of jazz, and his accomplishments continued to grow. By 1956, he would be on Time magazine. He would meet with President Eisenhower, who believed that race relations in the United States had made a negative impact with America's reputation internationally. So the State Department wanted musicians to promote American values. And he made Ellington one of the jazz ambassadors for the United States. And Ellington toured across the world. Ironically, as times began to change, especially during the Civil Rights era, Duke Ellington had started to include non-segregated clauses in his contract and refused to play in front of segregated audiences. Duke Ellington was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Richard Nixon, and even after his death in 1974, he was known as one of the greatest composers in the United States and one of the prominent figures sustaining jazz. Duke Ellington earned 12 Grammys awards from 1959 to 2000. Ellington's final words was, before he died due to lung cancer, "It was music is how I live, why I live, and how I will be remembered."